My friends, we're going to be having a very wide-ranging conversation this morning, revolving around the problems, the real problems, or the perceived problems in science, and maybe offering some solutions too. And I was curious to see if the average Joe or Jane in the street would go to the internet and look up science. What is science? What's it all about? And the first thing that came up was simply something right off the Google search. Science, noun, the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. And then I looked a bit further and I found a page at NASA devoted to students, kids, younger students, probably what we might call elementary school age. Science is observing the world, watching and listening, observing and recording. Science is curiosity and thoughtful action about the world and how it behaves. And I thought that was pretty nice, yeah, for students to get that grasp of, or an introduction to science. What else is science? As Richard Dawkins said, science is the poetry of reality. And I think that is just a wonderful quote. Mm. And the more you think about it, the more wonderful it becomes. Carl Sagan said, the method of science is tried and true. It's not perfect, but it's the best we have. The science has been around since antiquity, of course, but modern science really, as we understand it, when people started to be called scientists, really dates from the 16th and the 17th century, even though we can take it back to antiquity in the days of ancient Greece especially. So it's a wonderful thing. We all agree on that, but it's got its problems. As Carl Sagan said, it's not perfect. It's the best we have, but it's not perfect. And science continually strives to improve itself in what it understands and what it studies. But we want to look at some of the real problems that face us today in science in general. So let me kick off with a quick question to the panel regarding science. Do you think one of the problems in science in general is the fact that humans may have evolved to have a short attention span? Now, what I mean by that is that in order to grasp a scientific concept, it's not something you can just do in a couple of hours or whatever it is. You need to study things thoroughly. And in the age of something like the 20 or 30-second TV commercial, which gives you instant information, instant gratification, Twitter's, internet, and all that sort of thing, is one of the problems that science has, and always has, is it's too complex and it's just far easier to do other things. Rachel?
Well, I think one of the problems is that science is not absolute. So we never can say something is proven. We can say that the evidence suggests that we think this happens, but we can only do that to within 95% of proof. So nothing is black and white. So I think people find that hard to deal with because if they say to you, so you have evidence that this drug works, and you say, well, all the evidence suggests that it does, people don't accept that as an answer. People don't understand that we approach zero, but we never get to zero, and nothing is ever black and white. And the interpretation of that by the popular media or populist blogs and things like that confuses the issue even further, which can lead to conflicting information appearing in the face of consumers, like 1 week broccoli causes cancer, the next week it doesn't cause cancer. Science is an extremely nuanced process that is never absolute, and we understand that, but I don't think we communicate that well to consumers, and that just creates confusion.
Do you think that's a problem in communication, Cara?
I mean, yeah, I think that's a shortcoming of communication. I think it's also, as you mentioned, I mean, you posed the question as, is the issue that we as a species or as individuals have evolved to be more short-sighted or to have a shorter attention span? And I would disagree with that, unless you maybe weren't being as concrete as I took the question.
All right.
maybe culturally we are evolving in that direction, but I don't think evolutionarily speaking we are like incapable of practicing science.
Well, maybe I was looking at the angle as science is not always intuitive.
Absolutely. I mean, that's kind of like definitive about science, is that it's often not intuitive. But I think we also sometimes have to remember that there are a lot of scientists. And there are a lot of people who are really good at it. People who have dedicated their lives and really put a lot of effort and energy into it. And I think that recruitment ebbs and flows for sure. And I think that there is a problem with maybe scientific mindset across the course of society. But I don't want to sell all of the incredible scientists who do put a lot of effort into it and are very kind of not short-sighted, you know what I mean, and who have deep attention spans and have committed 20, 30, 40 years to trying to answer one research question. I think we've got to remember that that does exist as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Good point.
I think, I mean, at least within my field, what I'm seeing is that it's the long-term goal. It's the long view is that what people engages the scientists. Perhaps it's the short attention spans from the public that can be difficult in keeping them engaged and providing the nuances. But I find maybe perhaps a bigger problem is that we are just so fond of positive reinforcement. We really like positive results, and for example, the way that my PhD program is set up is I need to have 3 papers accepted. So I have to have some positive results that I can sell to somebody and make a good story out of. And so seeking that positive reinforcement of publishable research is, I think, problematic because we end up ignoring negative results that are oftentimes very important.
Absolutely.
I think a bigger problem in terms of attention span is funding bodies have a short attention span.
Britt, can I ask you just to move your microphone a bit closer to your mouth there? What do you mean by that exactly?
So I work in research science and we rely on funding, mostly in my particular field, we get a lot of philanthropy, but most universities rely on public funding, and at least in Australia, for many, many years, the longest amount of grant you could apply for is 3 years. So you can't solve a long-term problem in 3 years. You just simply can't. Science is complicated. You know, like Ben Goldacre says, I think you'll find it's more complicated than that. It's more complicated than 3 years. You know, you can't even do a PhD in a wet lab in 3 years. And so recently, Australia increased that to 5 years if you give them good enough reason. But feasibly, it's extremely difficult to do good science with the short attention spans of funding bodies. Yeah. We need to have access to money for 10 years, you know, presuming we can prove that we're using it well. Yeah. But, you know, there are so many people that I know that end up at the end of the 3 years, they don't get their grants renewed, they're gone, and so essentially they've wasted the previous 3 years of money. Anyway, I have a lot of feels about this.
I really agree with that. And I think that that's really a function of, I think there's a human nature component to that, but I've been talking about this a lot recently in interviews. A lot of that kind of aspect of the zeitgeist really comes from government, and obviously, like, the Australian government, the American government, there are a lot of similarities there, you know, these kind of like Western establishment, and whereas we have a different kind of democracy in America, we have term limits that are quite short, and I think that in some ways that's the best thing about our democracy, but in other ways it really does make people function in like this 2 to 4 year time span, and they're never thinking about anything beyond re-election. Yeah. And so because of that, almost all of our structure is built around that, and it becomes really problematic when you're trying to set up the future. Yeah, I agree with that. Because it's all about my legacy right now. You know what I mean? So we've got to figure out how to sort of change the zeitgeist. And I think historically we were better about this. I think historically, for example, our executives, like our presidents, set legacies, and there was an understanding of the next term to like fulfill the legacy of the previous president, regardless of if they were in a different political party. But now it just seems like every 4 years or every 8 years we're undoing the previous president's legacy. Yeah, that's exactly right. Almost like just to do it, right?
That's a very good...
Well, that's what's happening now, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's problematic because I do think it trickles down to a lot of different areas, and science is one of the areas that suffers from that.
Yeah.
So you're studying at the moment you're living and studying in Germany,
Right.
Britt. Does this reflect what you see in that country?
I think so. Funding is always a problem. Our PhD program is 3 years. Nobody gets it done in 3 years.
3 years? Oh.
Yeah. So
Joy.
it really
so short.
But you're killing yourself all the way through, and then you don't finish, and then you're worried about having funding to get your project finished. And oftentimes you have people sort of taking shortcuts or producing messy work. So 5 years is a better limit. And
so
then
you have to produce 3 papers in 3 years.
Right.
Wow, that's a huge
it's
undertaking.
It's a huge undertaking, and oftentimes you're just picking up on a postdoc's work, trying to carry on their legacy. And it's always, am I going to have enough money for next year, whether or not you're a PhD student, postdoc, junior professor, whatever. It's the same type of funding problem. And no one ever really gets established, like you just said, to think about what it is that they want to produce long term, because we don't know where you're going to be living, if you're going to get paid, if your project's going to continue to get funded.
Yeah.
Well, let me expand on that a little bit, because one of the notes I had when I was contemplating this panel was about the way as a society we invest in science. We put our resources into it. And history shows us that when societies invest in science, it pays off in the long run. Even if it's paying off in ways we can't envisage, like the moon or the space program famously had runoff effects that we couldn't envisage at the time. Why is it then that government seems so reluctant to invest in science? And I talk specifically at the moment in Australia, where I don't know if we do have a minister for science or we don't, or they're not very... We do, of course we do. But
well, they just appointed one in America like this week, so...
They appointed a minister for science?
No, appointed one in the Trump administration this week, I believe. Is that right?
I don't know. I wouldn't trust that. I mean, like, whoever, hopefully it's somebody who's actually a scientist, and not a climate denier.
Probably not.
But
no.
It would be funny if the American government had a minister for science, but but nevertheless,
science advisor.
Science
advisor.
advisor.
Things like that.
But the point is, we've seen this from governments that they can't see the benefit. Are they really thinking of the 4-year term or the 6-year term, and that's the limit of their comprehension?
Sure.
Get the votes, right?
They cannot pass the marshmallow test. Like, nobody in government would pass the marshmallow test.
The what?
You know what I mean?
We call that the musk stick test.
The musk stick test. But see, the problem with the musk, no child wants one of those. That's the difference. So, Walter Michel's famous marshmallow test is you give a child a marshmallow and you say, you can eat it. You can eat it now, or if you wait, I'll give you 2 marshmallows. Yeah. And some people can do it and some people can't. And, it's about what will this do for me right now?
Yes.
Don't make me think about a return on my investment.
Yes.
If I'm going to make this decision, I need to see immediate results. And part of that, I think, it's easy for us to denigrate and say, oh, politicians, they're all, not very bright. But part of it is because if they can't show their constituency immediate results, they won't vote for them. Know what I mean? Like, we're kind of to blame here, and we have to remember that, too.
And that's a very good point, absolutely, because the politicians are just looking to get voted back in again, and that's what they should be doing. That's their job.
That's their job.
That's their job.
Yeah, but they also have a responsibility of leadership, whereby they should be saying to the people, we need to do this. And, this is what you see with some of the stuff that Trudeau is doing, and I don't know, he does some bad stuff too. But there are times when the populace just needs somebody to say, okay, we're going to invest in this because it's good for us as a society. In terms of economic return, you get a lot of return on investment on at least biomedical research investment. And so if you just flip-flop with whatever the public decides, you end up with a massive coal mine in Queensland right now. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's ridiculous. But I want to follow up on your point, because I think that scientists really have to get a kick up the butt for this, because we are so bad at communicating our research, and we're reluctant to communicate our research. And so then when the government turns around and says, we're cutting funding, we go, eh. And it's like, well, you guys didn't tell the people what you do. You have to tell and communicate your work to consumers so that they understand the value of it. So they will lobby the MPs. They will say to your politician, don't cut funding for cancer research or don't cut funding for whatever.
Yeah.
And yes, politicians have a job to show that there is some return on investment and economic value, but they've pushed it too far, at least in Australia, where they're now saying everything has to have IP and you have to be able to commercialise it. And that is fine in terms of their books add up, but we see time and time again that blue sky research is so important, and by blue sky research I mean people just kind of looking around to see what they might find without a specific aim or without a specific application for commercialisation. And we've seen this in Australia. We've seen this with the CSIRO, which is the Commonwealth Science Industry Research Organisation. So it's a government-funded, publicly funded research institute. Wi-Fi, hello.
Australian invention, right?
No, not completely, but we contributed some of the... Well, we can't take all the credit for it, Richard, but CSIRO...
We can when it works.
When it doesn't work, we didn't do it. But CSIRO contributed some of the technology to the development of Wi-Fi, and that came about through blue sky research, where they were just kind of looking around to see what they could find. But that kind of stuff requires long-term investment, and you probably never know if you're going to get your money back. So to try to funnel everybody into, you must commercialise this is short-sighted. However, to go back to the point, because I'm ranting a bit, scientists need to step up. We really do, because I really think we have to take some of the blame for people not understanding what we do if we don't tell them about it.
Oh, absolutely. And I think on the whole, though, you mentioned in that maybe you won't get your return on the investment. Maybe that's right for that one individual project, but on the whole, we get a huge return on our investment.
Absolutely.
When it comes to basic research.
Absolutely.
Not just applied research. So when you aggregate all of this together, the ROI is quite high for scientific investment, and the numbers are there to show it. Like, these numbers have been crunched, and you can literally say, look, if for every dollar you give me, our economy is going to get $7 back, or whatever the number is, and somehow that's not a convincing enough argument for people. Yeah. But I would also agree with you about SciComm. I mean, this is a really important part of my career. I do SciComm as a job, that's what I get paid to do in television and podcasting and all of that. But I also feel a strong responsibility to teach SciComm. And so this is a new aspect of my career that I started a few years ago, where some friends of mine and I decided to start what we call SciComm Camp. And we just finished our third year last weekend, 2 weekends ago, where we actually have, it's like a sleepaway camp for adults every year, and invite scientists. Many of them are early career scientists. Many of them are graduate students. We do find that they're the ones who are more interested in doing science communication.
How surprising.
Right? And do a weekend-long workshop and training in how to better communicate your science. And I do have hope for a sea change, because SciComm is sexy right now, and many, many young scientists are very interested in improving their science communication skills.
Yeah, definitely.
We're seeing a huge shift within academia, but the problem is that the old guard is still, in some ways, kind of in power.
And they push back a lot on
Absolutely.
that. In my experience, the old guard is very much pushing back against the new guys coming up and wanting to communicate.
Yeah. A lot of our students tell us that they can't tell their professors that they're at our training facility, because they will get, they'll kind of get yelled at for it.
That's too bad. See, my PI asked me to tweet things for him.
Yeah, that's good. That's great.
But don't you think, how much of it do you think is cultural? Now, I don't have hard numbers on this, but it's just my impression that if in Germany, you tell the public, a scientist tells the public, oh, you invest $1, you'll get $7 return. Generally speaking, you're going to have people buying into that and saying, okay, here's my dollar. Like, I may not see that dollar again, but I know it'll benefit society as a whole. And it could be because Merkel is a physicist, and so perhaps there's this sense that scientists are worthy and should run a country, or could run a country quite well. Germany's a leading economic powerhouse. They lead renewable energy. So there's a general cultural sense, at least it's my impression that this is the case, that science is worth investing in, and it doesn't take much convincing to tell people that some of our tax money should go there, because there's this idea that what's good for everybody is also good for me.
Yeah, it's much more collectivist in Germany. I mean, it is still like a modern Western nation, but I think the big problem with kind of American exceptionalism is that we are such an individualist society.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like all about me here. And that is not just imbued from the time you're quite young. It's actually something that people are taught to be proud of. It's so important
Take
to
care
our
of yourself
culture
first.
to take care of yourself first, and to not think in a collectivist way that of course that affects, almost every decision that we make. It's a problem.
Yeah, I think Australia falls in the middle there somewhere. I mean, we have had rallies in Australia where scientists have gone out on the streets in lab coats with placards and marched against funding cuts.
I've seen pictures.
Which we would never have been motivated to do, but it got to a point where the funding was getting so dire. And that really resonated with people because it was about funding cuts to biomedical research. And everybody knows somebody who's benefited from some cancer therapy or something like that. And so the people that did this, organised this march, they collected those stories, and so they gave a human face to science, and that resonated very well with people, and then a few years later they forgot all about it. But I think also the current government and the previous government in Australia tried to position scientists as elitist to the community because they're conservative and they don't like highly educated people that use evidence in what they do. Because our evidence was in contradiction to their policies, they're anti-climate change and...
I can't imagine living under a government like that.
It's not as bad as yours, okay? Well, I don't live under Trump now.
Yeah, I know. It's just.
But yeah, I mean, in my experience, because the evidence was contradicting what they wanted to do policy-wise, they just demonised us and pulled out the dirt unit and were like, these people are elitist and they don't have any place in our society. And I mean, they did some horrible stuff. They actually withheld funding for fellowships for early career researchers until they got some university cuts passed through to the Senate, right? So this was November, and people are waiting to know if they have a job next year as a researcher, and the government went, well, we're not going to tell you until we can, basically hold to ransom the opposition to allow us to cut uni funding. So there were scientists sitting around there for months going...
That happens almost every year in America when when they can't decide whether or not they want to do a government shutdown. That happens to NASA scientists across the country, where they're waiting around to see if they're non-essential personnel and whether or not they have to go into work. I have many, many friends who work at JPL, which is joint public-private, so in a way they're a little bit more buffered because JPL is NASA Caltech. But yeah, it's quite common. And those are the government-funded scientists, you know what I mean? Think about the scientists who are, private public, who are relying on the government, like trickle-downs, and are still trying, they can't get there without that kind of funding. Yeah. It's really, really difficult. Yeah. It's a really difficult issue.
And we wonder why people leave and go and work for pharma,
No, exactly. I mean, think about our best and brightest. Think about the people who are going through these incredible academic institutions. Where's their earning potential after the fact? Of course they're going to want to go work. But they're doing science as well. I don't want to denigrate, but of course you're going to want to go to Wall Street. Of course you're going to want to go work for big pharma and get into industry. Why would you want to, slave away at a publicly funded university or go be a NASA scientist where, sure, maybe there's guts and glory, but there is not a good paycheck at the end of that. NASA scientists do not get paid that well.
Completely.
And that's something we have to remember. A lot of times they're doing it because they care. They really are self-motivated there. And there is still, luckily in our society, a cultural positivity behind saying, I'm a NASA scientist. For a lot of little kids, that's still a dream of theirs. Thank goodness, because it's like being a teacher. in many ways, it's thankless.
Oh,
We do
it
not
sounds
support
terrific,
them.
doesn't it? But if you become a NASA scientist, then you're guarding the ice wall around the flat Earth and all that sort of stuff.
Absolutely.
Yes.
It's a very important job to have.
That's exciting stuff. Or faking the figures,
Yeah,
of course.
yeah.
Oh, yeah, of course you faked the moon landing.
Yeah, they're all really movie
That's
figures.
exciting stuff. I'd like to pick up with you, Britt, for a moment. And we were talking earlier about marketing or getting the ideas across to the population. And I'd like to look at the theme that you're very familiar with, is the marketing of true science versus the marketing of pseudoscience.
Yeah.
And you have in-depth experience in the presentation and the marketing of what I call pseudoscience, but to you at the time was not
Right.
correct.
Right.
Yeah. And why is it so easy for people to market acupuncture and homeopathy and all these things rather than the more conventional sciences?
I don't know if I can answer why it's so easy to market. I mean, the people marketing it, I believe, truly believe in it, so they're very passionate about it. You know, when I marketed these services, I used pretty pictures. I showed pretty healthy people, meaning skinny white people. And I would use lots of sort of pseudo-profound hyperbole, you know, to say things like, you know, you will be your healthiest you, optimal health. I would just string together beautiful sounding words. And if you're not thinking about it, or if you're not looking to catch the bullshit, you're just going to see pretty pictures, pretty people, some flowers, and then there's me saying, come to my office and I can make you look like this.
It's a simple story, isn't it?
And it's very simple. It's very simple. So as soon as you add complexities into it, which of course is, you know, medicine and real science, once it becomes nuanced, it becomes very difficult to sell. But the message is, take this vitamin, you will get healthy. Follow my advice, you will get healthy. Follow this diet, you will get healthy. Whatever. Pill in, health out.
No.
That's a good quote. Somebody write that down.
which is really ironic, because at the same time that we're saying take this capsule of magical herbs, we're also, you know, saying that medicine is so evil because all they do is provide pills to suppress symptoms. Yeah. But we're
this isn't a pill, right?
It's not a pill.
Supplement.
It's a plant.
It's very
it's a plant.
important.
Natural.
It's
Yeah,
natural.
it's
Natural.
Yeah.
But in reality, alternative medicine practitioners and even integrative medicine practitioners, even if they've gone to medical school, they're doing the exact same thing that they are criticizing medical doctors for, which is collecting symptoms and then, you know, matching a supplement to it. So, you know, this nonsense of treating the whole person, which sounds really lovely, it's all, you know, it's nonsense. They're not doing anything.
Yeah.
But it's an easy story to sell. It's an easy marketing story to sell.
Well, yeah, imagine being a person who's just found out that you have cancer, and you have quite a pernicious kind of cancer, and you're not sure what your prognosis is. And you're faced with decisions to make. And you talk to your physician, and your physician says, okay, the type of cancer that you have, it's going to be tough. We can start with a bit of radiation, but we may need to go into some chemotherapy. And, you know, you're going to get quite sick, but we've got these other drugs that we can give you while you're on it. And, you know, but there's still a chance that after we do all of this, you may not pull through.
Right.
And then you go to a homeopath or a naturopath or somebody who says, because there's no regulation here, right? So you don't have to say all of these. You can literally say, oh, don't worry, you just take the shark cartilage and your cancer will go away.
No. And what naturopaths will say is, I've had such and such patients, I've cured such and such patients using this therapy. And so, you know, they're not offering facts and figures and statistics and prognoses and survival rates.
Yeah,
They're not telling you what your 5-year survival rate is. They're saying, oh, I had a patient with this, they did this protocol, so we'll do the exact same thing for you. You know, individualized, right? But we'll do the exact same thing for you. And if you follow my prescription exactly, you will get better. If you don't get better, it's probably because you messed up somewhere along the way. It's never the natural treatment that failed. It's the patient who failed. And so, you know, the naturopath absolves himself of all responsibility. It says, I can only tell you how to be healthy and perfect, but you committing to your health is your issue, and that's that. So
can you imagine an oncologist doing that? Of course not.
Of course not.
Of course not. Because there's something called medical ethics, right? Like this is important to the profession. And also there is real concern about the cancer science behind this. And, there's real hard data.
Yeah. I said at my talk that there's, that naturopaths aren't trained in ethics. And we do take an ethics course, but when you're taught that it's okay to use homeopathy to treat cancer or to treat an acute asthma attack, or that it's okay to use energy healing to cure literally any disease under the sun, that's not ethics. That's not real ethics. Yeah. When the conversation is, which modality did you use and why, and how to justify that, that's not ethics. That's total health fraud.
Yeah, it occurs to me as you're speaking that we've got a situation here of two competing stories, a narrative to give to people. The one is that what you were used to be engaged with, what people are engaged with now with the natural therapies, we might say the naturopathy, they're selling that story. And alongside that, they're selling the story of conspiracy, or the real medicine, what the doctors prescribe, is part of the conspiracy to keep you ill and all this sort of thing. So it's a double-barreled approach, isn't it, with this storytelling?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I'm good, medicine's evil. That's the story.
And that's tough for us to combat, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. So people, so it's also, the patients that go to naturopaths are a self-selecting population. So they already have some of these fears, right, that conventional medicine has made them sick or is making them sick or keeping them sick. If they're really ill with something like cancer, they're scared, so they're primed, and there's some motivated reasoning also to believe whatever it is that the naturopath is telling them. And it's really hard to combat those biases when the patient already has them coming into your office. And naturopaths are getting really good at making their clinic look like a real medical clinic, but also providing, like a warm and fuzzy and
they talk about patients. Atmosphere. They talk about patients presenting with symptoms. They use all the language of science, don't they?
They definitely use all the language of science. You fill out, for example, so if you came to my office where I worked in Arizona, and many cancer patients did, it would feel very much like a regular doctor's visit, where you would check in, perhaps talk about insurance, fill out paperwork, someone would come and get you. You would do vital signs and the whole shebang. Wow. So it emulates medicine as much as possible. But then when it comes to talking about treatment, the treatment, of course, is not evidence or science-based therapies. It's, this is what my experience says works, and let's do that.
And how is the patient to know the difference? I live in Los Angeles. I have a lot of friends who are into medical woo. One of my closest friends is fully absorbed in this world. And, she's always telling me, I think when you talk about it being self-selective, I think there's something quite empowering for the patient that they get to be active participants in this activity. Like it really, she's constantly fighting a heavy metal toxicity, or the yeast that's growing because of the heavy metal toxicity, or the vitamin deficiency that she has because of the yeast, because of the heavy metal. And so every day she's getting these infusions, or she's taking these capsules, and then once she works on that and her levels are different, and then she gets to work on the next problem. And I think it gives her something to do, and it gives her a feeling of empowerment over her health.
Well, it's two sides of the same coin, right? So on the one hand, you are in charge of your health, and you feel empowered, and you can change your diet and take these supplements and be as healthy as you want to be. But if the treatment doesn't work, it's because you didn't do it well enough.
Absolutely, and that's absolutely the case for somebody who actually has cancer. But I think so many people go in because of this nebulous, I just kind of sometimes feel bloated. It's like they're going in because it's naturopathy is also kind of like a health spa.
It's also like a health spa, and we naturopaths are really good at attributing any symptom to any disease.
Yeah.
So, like, oh, you get headaches in the morning? Oh, and you also drink caffeine? Okay, well, you probably have a caffeine sensitivity.
Yeah.
So we should do a detox.
Oh, detox.
It can literally be that simple.
Yeah.
It can be that simple. You fill out a little, the health forms are crazy long, and there's all these boxes to tick, and it's like, do you have to get up and pee in the middle of the night ever? Do you ever get a headache? Do you sometimes feel tired? And then you just connect.
Oh my God.
And then you can connect the dots and make up a diagnosis. And chronic fatigue syndrome, I'm sorry, you have
Can
it.
I come and see you later, Britt?
I charge $500 an hour, so.
A bargain. Let me get back to the theme of stories, because as I was saying, it occurred to me that when you were speaking, there were two competing stories. As we're often told, especially at Skeptics meetings, that humans are storytelling animals. And it's absolutely true. And there's been some incredible work done recently by the Australian author Lynn Kelly, who's a good friend of ours, we're delighted to say, who wrote a book on skepticism. The Skeptic's Guide to the Paranormal, I think was her book, was a wonderful book. But she's recently been doing some work, and she's written a book called The Memory Code, which is an in-depth look into the way that pre-literate societies passed down knowledge and information. And what she's discovered is extraordinary, absolutely incredible, involves things like Stonehenge and ancient rituals around the world, is how our ancestors, all our ancestors, when they lived in those societies, needed to pass down information to survive. End of story. And the amount of detailed information that humans can commit to memory through ritual and song and structure is mind-blowing. If you have a chance to look up the Memory Code, I sincerely recommend it. But she wrote this when she was writing about science and skepticism. She said, some believers accuse skeptics of having nothing left but a dull, cold, scientific world. I am left, then, with only art, music, literature, theatre, the magnificence of nature, mathematics, the human spirit, sex, the cosmos, friendship, history, science, imagination, dreams, oceans, mountains, love, and the wonder of birth. And that will do me. And I think that's a pretty good... That's a pretty good comeback if believers accuse all of us of having no soul or imagination or anything like that.
No soul.
That's right.
I don't have a soul, actually. Sorry to tell you.
But I find, I just want to say, I had lots of made-up explanations for how things in the body worked as a naturopath. And once I studied real science and real physiology, I found the real explanation far more beautiful and eloquent.
Well, we think of Richard Dawkins again, the magic of reality.
It was really incredible to actually find out how things really work. The story was far better.
That's true, and that's a story I think science should be stressing and telling, because when we have such wonders brought to us by science, which is truth is stranger than fiction or better than fiction or more wondrous, why is it then, and we get back to the marketing, I suppose, that fables and pseudoscience do so well? Is it because people can just basically make stuff up and market that?
Well, yeah, there's no regulation to marketing. I mean, there is some regulation to marketing, but of course, if you have to describe reality as it is, with all its caveat and nuance, you're not going to get as much traction as making up the best possible version of the story. But I think it's also because people are... So yes, there's the ethics side of that. There's the lack of nuance. But I think also when it's a simple explanation, and we talked about this previously, it's much easier to buy something that makes intuitive sense.
Yes.
It's not just about it being easier, it's about it being intuitive.
Yes.
Right? And so it requires a lot of effort to understand a kidney. It's not an easy organism or organ. It's it's a complicated situation going through the nephron and understanding how that all works. And it's a much easier thing. It's like, well, garbage in, garbage out. Your body's a swamp, and if you eat things that are very toxic, then you're going to accumulate toxins,
right.
And then you're going to be sick from it. It's a much quicker and in some ways, more elegant explanation to people. And so they are more attracted to that. The truth of the matter is, once you start to dig into it, I think that I know it doesn't hold muster. But there's also something to be said, and this is more of a philosophical take and a psychological take, that you were talking about understanding real physiology and finding beauty and wonder in real physiology. There's something quite lovely about working and having an outcome at the end of hard work. And I think that you almost have when you have a deeper understanding, because you've done the work, which is not always easy in science, right? To understand something. It's effortful.
Yes.
But then when you can see something that's complicated and actually start to make the connections, the depth of the beauty becomes much stronger. The same way I truly do believe that it's very hard to experience passion and joy if you've never experienced loss or sadness. It's very difficult to have one extreme of emotion if you've never operated at the other end of the spectrum. And if you're hanging out somewhere in the middle, it's quite difficult to have a deep perspective of that. And so when things are sort of lacking in nuance, easy, moderate, it's quite easy to just hang out in that in that middle space and really not appreciate the true poetry of reality.
It's less threatening and more comfortable to hang out in the middle space.
Absolutely, but you're also limiting yourself in so many ways.
That extrapolates to research too.
Absolutely.
And as you were talking about that, I was thinking that the way you speak about it almost romanticizes it. And there are people in this audience that know me, and my brain broke for 3 years recently trying to work out the mechanism of a drug, and I still don't understand it. But the results that I got when I initially did blinded experiments were completely the opposite to what I would expect, completely different to what a colleague had published months earlier, and absolutely broke my brain. And it would be really easy as a scientist to go, that is so weird, it must be wrong, I'm just going to put it over there, and go down the middle with the stuff that's already been established, that is intuitive, that makes sense.
You can make a story that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Right.
But we decided to go that way, and we still are not sure what's going on, but we think we found something brand new. But that is really scary as a scientist, because the first thing you think is, I've made a mistake, I've got imposter syndrome now, I'm a bad scientist.
And that's
so that is a really difficult thing to do in science.
And that's what you're thinking in the moment, and that's what you're thinking in all of the surrounding moments. But when you put yourself, and sorry to get like existential and weird here, but when you put yourself on your deathbed and you think about the contributions that you've made in your life, and you think about the deep emotional connection that you have to those impacts, if you had just gone that easy route, think about the lack of depth that you would be experiencing then. But going out on a limb and doing something scary and putting a lot of effort into the work that you do always pays dividends. It always pays dividends in the long run.
I was about to say, yeah.
And that's the hard thing. It's in the long run.
In the meantime,
and again, we're not good at thinking about
yeah, in
what's
the meantime, you're in the
long
fetal position going, oh my God, oh my God.
Yep.
Like, what am I doing?
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true.
I find that alternative practitioners, at least in my experience, are really good at matching the concept that's really easy to understand, like with your kidney example. Trash in, trash out, or you have to clean up your diet or whatever. So you take a simple story like that, like say you want to put a patient on a kidney detox. You want to, you're going to make diet recommendations, but then you're also going to recommend something that acts like a diuretic so that patient pees more. So then the story becomes easy for the person, for the patient to buy into it, because they're going to come back and report, oh, I'm going to the bathroom all the time now.
You're getting rid of the toxins.
And then the alternative practitioner can say, yeah, look at all the toxins you're getting rid of. Good for you. And it becomes a very, very, very simple story that doesn't require any thinking beyond counting how many times they've gone to the toilet that day.
It's reassuring. to have that simple story, isn't it, for a patient?
I think so.
It's so when people need reassurance, the simple story is not the more complicated medical situation, but the simple story. We'll just detox your kidney. Here we go.
And that's why it's really disgusting, because the truth is, I think it's super easy as skeptics sometimes to get caught up and to blame the victim. And the truth of the matter is, when you actually exercise a bit of empathy and you put yourself in the shoes of a desperate patient who does have limited understanding of their own biology and who is using their own heuristics to try and make decisions about the world, and they have this data in front of them, good data. I urinated 10 times more than I usually do, and my pee was clear, and it looked like water, and I'm healthier than I've ever been.
And I slept better last night.
And it's not that person's fault for not being educated enough. Yeah. It's the charlatan's fault for taking advantage of that
I totally agree. And harking back to Lynn Kelly, one of her points is she doesn't like to use the word gullible. In her context, she was talking about people who go to see psychics for reassurance. And she says gullible is the wrong word, vulnerable is a far more apt word. They are the victims in this situation. We'll change the course of the conversation now away from the storytelling aspect of it to the more mundane, mechanical. And there is a real issue when it comes to science in general and throughout our society, of course, with sexism perceived or imagined, or the public's perception of it, or its real impacts in academia and scientific research. And it's an area where I'll happily let my panelists take the lead here, because I'm an old white man. And I don't have this direct experience, I really don't. So Dr. Rachael, from your point of view, how big is the problem? Is it a big problem? And what can we do about it?
Well, the problem encompasses, I think, not just sexism, but sexual harassment, bullying, and inequity, and that applies to women, people of colour, and other minorities. It's not just women.
Of course.
And it's kind of been trickling out over the last kind of couple of years, and just recently with the social media campaign #MeToo, which was a result of the Harvey Weinstein allegations, there's more coming out about people actually now speaking out about being bullied or sexually harassed or harassed in research. And the details
in all walks, but we'll look at research.
Absolutely,
at the moment.
but I mean, the details are sorted and pretty much the same, but also horrific. But what's interesting is the reason why people didn't speak out for such a long time. So there are some incidences where one woman spoke about being harassed by an advisor, but she waited 20 years to say something, which immediately people go, well, why did you wait 20 years, you know?
Because there was a power dynamic there.
Well, this is what I wanted to touch on, right? Yeah. So, I mean, this is not unique to science, but it is particularly pernicious in science. Thanks for the word, Cara.
Yeah.
It's a good word.
It's a good word. I use it too much, but it's always such a good word.
Sorry, what word was that? Science?
Pernicious.
Oh,
yeah.
Because there's such a power imbalance between you as a student and your advisor, and this continues beyond being a student, by the way, and the way it plays out is that basically the person who mentors you and trains you, they can pretty much control the trajectory of your career, because if they don't get you to publish papers very soon in your PhD, you're behind the 8 ball. If they're not directing you to present at the right conferences, you're behind the 8 ball. If they decide for any reason that they want to sabotage you, they can very easily do that, and then they can use their position of power to threaten you in various ways. And the thing that this particular woman who spoke out about harassment, she waited 20 years because she waited to get tenure, so permanent employment in a university.
Oh, that's so sad.
Because the risk to her in terms of undermining and the potential for this person to just, for example, in terms of practicalities, if a grant that she's put in for comes across this person's desk, if she's spoken out about them, they can write and say it's bad and dismiss it, and so she won't get funding. If any of the papers that she submits to journals come across this person's desk, if they decide they don't like her, they can reject them.
And that's an extreme example if she spoke out about him, but if you think about it, it's often much more nuanced than that. What if I overtly reject in advance? Then is he going to be rejected? And is this like the fragility of the ego involved is he going to lash back out in a certain way? And we've seen this time and time and time again in incredibly public ways. I mean, there's recently a scandal with Christian Ott at Caltech that gained a lot of traction. I know these women that were harassed by him. It's like, and the truth is, I've spoken to a lot of women within the sciences, but even outside of it, and I don't know, I think, a single woman who's never experienced at least some amount of harassment. And I always like to broaden the conversation. This is not a science problem. This is a societal problem.
Absolutely, yes.
Like, when I moved out of science and I moved into production, I moved into Hollywood, and people were like, ooh, it's bad in science. And I was like, yeah, you guys, come on. Like, and it's not just the sexism, and like you said, it's not just the racism, and it's like this whole kind of combined zeitgeist in America of this under the radar tribalism, of this, the power dynamics, gripping to power and using everything you can to try and maintain that power. And I think that we have to use learning examples. Oftentimes, when we start talking about this and you've got like a very feministic panel and then people say, oh, you're being too PC. And it's really not about, are we PC, are we not PC? And I would like to use, and I know this is not going to be a popular thing to do, I would like to use last night as a learning example.
Oh, okay.
So, well, and first of all, I will say that, like, we've got to remember, too, that this happens all the time, and it happens right in front of our faces. There are people at this very conference who do not have good track records about this, and this is something we have to remember, and we have to be aware of it, and we have to talk about it if we feel safe to talk about it. But I will use an example for last night, and I don't want to throw anybody under the bus. We are at SciCon, and last night there was a wonderful costume contest. And I say it was wonderful because we won first. And another couple won an award as well. And that couple was dressed up as a pimp and a hoe at a costume contest in 2017. And not to throw them under the bus, because of course I think that sometimes cultural insensitivity comes from the fact that we haven't had to put ourselves in this situation to utilize the empathy that we need to utilize to understand why that's a problem. But in 2017, caricaturing a pimp as though this is something that, as though it's not like walking up and saying, I'm dressed up this Halloween as a sex criminal. Yeah. Really, as a sex trafficker. That's what a pimp is a sex trafficker. And a hoe is a sex slave. It's somebody who is beaten within an inch of her life in an effort to keep her working and making money for her owner. And these are things that, but if you've never met somebody who's worked in the sex trade, you know what I mean? And you've never experienced those kinds of conversations, because we sweep those kinds of things under the rug, then you can't exercise the empathy, and you can caricature it, and you can think of it. Only recently, within the past few decades, have we understood that, like, a white person putting on blackface is problematic. Now when we see it, we go, ugh. And eventually when we see, and again, I apologize for bringing it out into the open, but eventually when we see somebody dressed up as a pimp and a hoe, it'll make us feel gross when we see it, because we'll be aware of that. But it takes speaking about these things to understand the awareness. And this is not me being too PC. There is something about progressive thought and about education that leads to not just, oh, I'm too sensitive about certain things. It's not about me being sensitive. I'm not personally offended by this. And my personal emotions are not so fragile that I can't get over being personally offended. It's me trying to empathize with somebody whose life is in the toilet and who obviously we're not taking the minute to think about. And so that's really why I think that these kinds of learning experiences are important. And I know that I went off on a tangent here, and this has less to do with science specifically. Yeah. But I think the whole thing about sexism and harassment and stuff in science is a microcosm of massive problems that exist within our society. And that's what we should generally be focused on, instead of talking about it as if it's a specifically scientific problem.
Well, you're absolutely right.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely, yeah.
Of course, it is a reflection of the broader part of society. But if I might ask you, Britt, from a slightly different perspective, when you were doing your work through the naturopathic system, situation, did you see more or less the same sort of things in that situation?
Oh, interesting.
Oh yeah. We had lots of, and there still are lots of examples of professors dating students, for example. Yeah, really yucky kind of examples. Yeah, the same type of harassment, the same type of sexual comments made, power plays made. It definitely exists in the alternative medicine community, in the naturopathic community. Although, we like to pretend as naturopaths that we're enlightened and we don't see.
But you guys are so cuddly and everything.
We're so cuddly and we wear patchouli and even if we don't shave our armpits, we're still going to get harassed.
When you were doing your studies there, when you were involved in that whole situation, and forgive me if I don't instantly know, what was the ratio of men to women doing that sort of thing? Not harassing, I mean. Going through the system. In my
So the
perception,
naturopathic student body is predominantly women. I think it's about 80% women.
About 80%?
About 80% women, but most of the professors, air quotes, most of the teachers are male.
Did you say air quotes? All right.
Yeah, because if you teach at a naturopathic school, you're not a professor. And it drives me crazy. I think it's so, you're not a professor if you teach at a naturopathic school. You don't have a real degree. You didn't go through the academic system. You didn't earn that title.
They call themselves professors?
They call themselves professors.
They call themselves doctors.
They call themselves doctors. They call themselves physicians.
Well, George Rapp called himself a professor last night. I noticed that.
He's a professor of funk, though.
Oh, sorry.
Come on.
Looking back, it's funny. There's a lot of energy medicine, healing touch, laying the hands on type medicine. There's a lot of physical contact in alternative medicine and in naturopathic medicine. So you have a class that is 80% young women, and the instructor is an old white guy, and he is putting his hands on students, demonstrating some technique. And it's not just, the head or the hand. It can be quite intimate, lower back or abdomen or around breast tissue, for example. And it's just sort of accepted because, well, at least it was my perception at the time that it's sort of accepted because it's in the context of healing, of learning.
Wow.
But when you step out of it and you look at it, it's really quite gross.
It sounds creepy.
And I kid you not that in these situations, I had a former friend, and we were in one of our physical medicine classes, and by the end of the, and he was demonstrating all of these techniques on us, and by the end of the semester, they were sleeping together, and it turns out he was also sleeping with another student in the class at the same time.
Nice.
Yeah, so it's quite pervasive.
So it is. It certainly sounds like it. Despite what we might be told about the natural, loving, all wonderful.
No, the ratio of it actually might be higher because there's less people in the community.
Oh, interesting.
Thank you very much for your insights. Paging Dr. Freud. I'll just go back to my old white man club now, folks. Thank you very much. Oh, somebody write that down. Okay. Well, we've still got a little bit of time, so I'd like to cover some other issues right now when we might come to think about problems in science. And one of the biggest problems, Dr. Rachael, in the last few years for us certainly has been fraud.
Yeah.
And let's point the finger at Andrew Wakefield because his fraud wherever he is, down there somewhere.
He's moving to LA, apparently.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Why?
I just heard last night, and apparently I think he's possibly going to be starting a TV show on vaccine injury, and so he's going to be based in LA.
Do you know if that's like got public, or is it a TV show on actual network or
We
cable?
we don't know, and I can't take the... The other guy is out there. That's hilarious.
It's nice to know George has a career after entertainment, isn't it? And speaking of fraud,
So no, I can't take the credit for this either. A friend of mine has been diligently watching all the live videos out of the Vax tour in America, and she gleaned that piece of information last night where he just mentioned that he's moving. But to go back to fraud, I mean, the problem of publish or perish never goes away in science. And if you don't know what that means, basically, peer-reviewed publications are currency in science. They make your CV long. They are the reason you'll get grants. They are the reason you'll get promotions. So you need to publish scientific peer-reviewed papers. And that is hard, particularly in the wet sciences, like all of them really, but I'm speaking from my own personal experience. Biology never goes the way you hope it goes. It never does what you ask it to do. And, I mentioned earlier that I got completely different results in some of my recent experiments than what I expected. But you have to somehow package that up into a nice, shiny little paper so you can present it to your board, to your directors, to your funding bodies. And so there's enormous pressure on researchers to publish and to publish often. And this, unfortunately, leads to people cutting corners because they are so pressured to do so. Many of us in this room would be aware of Chris Shaw, Professor Chris Shaw, who is he's in the Department of Ophthalmology at a university in Canada, and he publishes anti-vaccine papers all the time. And just recently, it's just like, it's so dumb, it annoys me so much. There's a technique called Western blotting where you end up with these little bands that look like just a line on a paper. And ultimately when you do develop, it's like a photography development process for you to get that little band. And ultimately when you do that, you're going to get artifacts introduced, like a hair or a dot or something. But scientists repeatedly do this. They copy and paste those bands into different experimental lanes, and maybe they flip them upside down or maybe they flip them the other way, but they never remove the artifacts. And so it's so obvious that they've done it.
I've seen this, yes.
And it drives me mental because it's like, get Photoshop out, boot it up. Like, if you're going to cheat properly. And recently, Christopher Shaw had a paper retracted for precisely that reason. The bands in this case were actually polymerase chain reaction bands. And you could easily see that there was these two bands. One was supposed to be the untreated animals, one was supposed to be the treated animals. But the bands, if you flip them and turn them, they were the same. And so the paper got pulled. And it actually went all over the world, the reports of this, because it was a controversial study to begin with. He was trying to claim that aluminium causes autism. And he said in response, well, to be fair, nobody zooms in on these things and looks at the artifacts in them. And I'm like, dude,
wow.
Of course we do that. And there are people that work in research who dedicate their lives to looking for things like that. And it's not very difficult if you have half a brain. And then he also said, well, in my defense, the raw data has gone to China with my postdoc, and that also breaches the ethics of the university. You're not supposed to take data off the premises because the intellectual property belongs to the university where it was generated. Yep. And so it is a dumpster fire, but this is not the first time this particular group has had papers retracted. But to go back to Wakefield as well, and I mentioned this briefly yesterday at SGU, one of the problems with papers that get retracted for fraud is that they get cited more often after they've been retracted.
And that is a real problem in science, isn't it?
And, I spend a lot of time trawling the depths of the anti-vaccination movement online.
Did you say trawling or trolling?
Yeah, a bit of both. And they don't care that a paper's retracted anyway.
Well,
That's not relevant to them because they're cherry-picking the data for their confirmation bias. So it's not relevant to them that it's retracted. That still is a thing. Anyway.
But is this a problem science tries to address as best it can?
Absolutely. I mean,
of course,
the scientists on the journals, the peers who are doing the review, are the ones who are pushing for these retractions. Within the scientific community, a retracted paper is a black box. You know what I mean? It's but it's outside of the scientific community where the problem lies. It's with the marketing. It's with the individuals who are using these retracted. And the bad thing is, you mentioned, not only does sometimes, especially if it's quite a famous paper, does it get cited more often after it's retracted, but also, study after study show that the retraction gets no traction, right? That once you can't unring a bell.
Yeah.
And so once you go out there and there's a big splash within the media and people say, this is what we found, this is a real effect. And then later they go, ooh, it turns out that effect's not real. Nobody listens to the retraction.
Buried, yes.
But there are some great organizations like Retraction Watch. I highly recommend following Retraction Watch, because not only do they keep their eyes out as a real public service of what is getting retracted, but they do really good public communication of science, really good write-arounds around it to explain, what's going on with that. The problem is, only nerds like us are reading this.
Yeah.
Right.
But I think we could do a little bit of a better job preventing fraud in the first place.
Yeah.
For medical journals, for example, and publishing clinical trials, we could do a better job making sure that the research trials are registered and that the results have been published within the appropriate time frame before, letting the work get published. When it comes to our fields in basic science, I think we could perhaps do a better job in making sure our scripts are included perhaps in the data set. So the statistical work could be checked because a lot of errors get made here, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not intentionally, but it's another way to check it if you have the script to look through. Making sure that the gen bank sequences or the DNA sequences is actually where the researcher says it is, that it's actually been deposited online, that these little things are actually followed through on. Because oftentimes, especially as a new researcher, I'm going back paper after paper after paper, and I'm in the methods section, and I'm going through it, and the results aren't where they say they are, or the DNA sequence that I'm looking for is not where they said it is. Yeah. Or I'm looking at this statistical package and trying to track it down, and I get halfway through and it doesn't make sense. And these are easy things to check and to require.
Just steps missing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You can't follow the methods.
I didn't tell you how I did this PCR.
Yeah. And then how are you supposed to emulate that? And you know what? Here's a thought. Might be unpopular, because we've talked about jargon in the past and about why jargon is important and what jargon actually is in science and the purpose that it serves. But I read a recent neuroskeptic blog where individuals have gone in and looked at the readability of scientific articles, and they're getting worse and worse. And so maybe make your paper easier to understand.
Yeah, this drives me crazy.
I completely agree with that.
Because you know what? It's really hard to replicate a study
if it's unnecessarily fancy.
If it takes you 10 times to read this paper before you even understand what's going on.
I have a bugbear about this thing called self-plagiarization in science. It drives me insane. So I understand that you can't plagiarize, that's fine. But in the methods section of a paper, you're supposed to describe your experiments to enough detail that someone else can reproduce them. And if you do the same methods often, you cannot copy and paste that into your recent publication. And I had an experience recently where I wanted to find someone's method, and I had to go back to 6 or 7 of their previous publications because they said, as described previously, got there, as described previously, okay, as described.
It's like a Russian doll.
I ended up at a book chapter that was in a library in, I don't know, I couldn't access it.
From 1978.
Crazy.
I know, it's totally
It's out of print.
Yeah. What the hell? But I wanted to just add quickly on the topic of public or perish that predatory publishing now has become a huge area of grey literature where basically companies are popping up all over the place, taking advantage of the fact that scientists have this huge pressure to publish and setting up basically fake journals where they'll say, if you pay me $300, I'll publish your paper and you'll get it within a week and there's going to be no peer review.
Except they don't always overtly say that.
They don't say that.
Yeah.
No.
And so they don't, a young researcher might not even know.
No, they don't. And there is a company that has turned this into a huge industry now, which has translated into conferences where they will look at conferences in a particular area of expertise. They'll change the title of theirs slightly, but not enough that you might notice it's not this highly prestigious conference. And then they'll just take bios and photos of scientists who are prestigious in the area, put them on a website and say, Cara is speaking at this conference, but they haven't asked you and they haven't told you. And so if you find yourself on this website and you email them and say, please remove me, I'm not involved in this, they won't do that either. Yeah. And then they'll charge $3,000 for you to turn up to a fake conference. And one of the things that I find so frustrating about that is that academics are so shruggy about it.
Yeah.
Like, I think David Gorski maybe invented the term shruggy, but I found when I was in the university system that I would say, okay, the dean of research here, you need to stand up in front of all the academics and warn them of these specific operations and what they do and tell them not to publish there, do not go to their conferences. They're like, nah.
That's how I ended up here, actually.
I think sometimes we rely too heavily in the sciences on our understanding of the big picture. And so we're like, well, science is self-correcting, right? And like, eventually enough people are going to try and replicate that stuff. But the problem is, it's only like that if we are active.
Exactly.
And we do it.
Yeah.
And so, and relying on somebody else to do the work is a recipe for disaster, especially because there's something good about science becoming very spread out. It's no longer monolithic, which is a wonderful thing. But when it becomes so spread out that studies are never replicated, when it becomes so spread out that nobody is ever talking to one another anymore, then what you end up with is no checks and balances and no self-correction within science and just a flood of information and no way to know what is legitimate and what's not, because we're just assuming that because these people are professionals, they don't make mistakes. There's a big difference between overt intentional fraud and kind of under-the-radar mistakes that are made, but the outcome often is the same, and we have to remember that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Richie, is there a collection that lists, or someplace that we can go that has a list of the predatory journals? Because I'm often looking to figure it out, but I don't know where to go.
Retraction Watch, which is what Cara mentioned. So there used to be a librarian called Jeffrey Beal, and he would curate a list of predatory publishers, and it just kept getting longer and longer and longer. And then one day, his list disappeared from the internet, and he went dark, and it went dark, and nobody knows why, unless anyone has an update in the audience. So it's been mirrored now by Retraction Watch. Okay. So Retraction Watch has a list of predatory publishers that they try to update, and it just keeps getting longer and longer. But yeah, a look in Retraction Watch.
That's good advice. I do like learning new things like that along the way at these sessions. Well, folks, as Carl Sagan said, and I remind you once more, the method of science is tried and true. It is not perfect, but it's the best we have. In the couple of minutes we have remaining to us, spitballing, I guess you'd say, what can we do to improve the general method of science or the problems it faces? Rachel.
I think that we should work closely with media. And we've had a lot of success doing this in Australia as scientists because media is they are our mouthpiece, and they are often accused of badly translating science and writing bad articles, and that's our fault. We need to deal with them well, we need to work with them, because if we want people to understand what we do, if we want to attract public funding, we want our work to be communicated well. And so we try to do that in Australia. The other thing that I don't think is really known very well in this country is a website called The Conversation. And this is an academic website where if you have a position in an academic institution, you can write articles for them in consultation with an editor, so they'll help you to structure it. It's usually only 800 words, and it's got a Creative Commons license on it.
Yeah, it's like
so,
a wire service. So
yeah,
SciAm will pick it up.
It'll get
Science News,
picked up
yeah.
by whoever wants to republish it,
Yeah.
and you only have to write one article, and then you can see it go viral potentially. So that's such a great way to get your science out to the public.
I think that's good. I think that, it's hard to solve all these problems individually, and I think that we could put a bunch of Band-Aids in different places, and we can say, you need to be more responsible as a scientist, or we need to be better about communicator and stuff. All these things are important. But I do think that something that's more kind of central and fundamental is that as an educational approach, I personally believe that we need more ethics education and we need more philosophy education within the sciences.
Yeah.
And if more individual scientists, but also individuals who don't study science at all, just people who go through college, are well-versed in basic philosophy and basic ethics, that could go a long way.
Yeah, yeah. 100% agree with that.
And Britt, you have a rather interesting perspective on all this, I know.
Yeah. Well, I have different ideas sort of floating through my head. On a global scale, I think we have to get, I would like to see more physicians involved, actually, and at an earlier level, so at the medical school level. And I'm really fortunate in that I have a bit of a younger audience, so I have a lot of people in med school reaching out to me to get advice from me about how to talk to their patients and future patients about alternative medicine. But what I was going to say was that I think we should start practicing difficult conversations with people who are close to us in our lives. Mm-hmm. So I study evolutionary genomics, and I was able to successfully explain my research and the point of my research to family members who are fundamental Christians.
Wow.
And we had a very lovely conversation, and everyone stayed respectful, and this is a difficult thing to do, but I think this is it was a safe place for me to start. Maybe it's not always safe for people to start talking about this stuff within their family, but it was a good place to start to try to figure out how to have these conversations with people who are very different than me and have a very different background and a very different ideology than me. And I think the better that we can get at having these difficult conversations from people from all walks of life, the better that we are going to be as a group, the more successful we're going to be as a group. We'll continue to grow, and I think the future and the outlook is going to be much more successful for us and much better for us in the end if we can learn to have these respectful conversations.
I think you're right,
Yeah.
and the fact that we acknowledge that there are so many problems in science can only be a good thing, that we can address the problems once we identify them. Ladies and gentlemen, what an honor it's been to share the stage with such august company. Would you thank Dr. Rachael Dunlop, Cara Santa Maria, and Britt Hermes?